Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event tonight. I'm David Washington, the Executive Director of the Dunstan Foundation, and we're really thrilled to be joining with Adelaide Uni's Creative People, Product and Places Research Centre to present a year-long series of events, which we've called Cultural Policy Futures. This is our second, and thanks for coming. I'd first like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the lands of the Kaurna people who have cared for this country for countless thousands of years and whose spiritual relationship with the land continues today. I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. A new tradition for me is to note that respect, acknowledgement of the Kaurna people and respect for their elders is important, but it doesn't mean a great deal unless it's followed by action. Today was the latest Closing the Gap data was released. An area of concern for the Dunstan Foundation is the area which we call youth justice, but we call it youth justice because we don't like to, as a society, to talk about the reality, which is children's justice. And it's an area of policy concern for us that, and moral and ethical concern as well, that the majority of children who are locked up tonight at the Adelaide Children's Prison, which we call the Adelaide Youth Training Centre, are Aboriginal. That young Aboriginal people are many, many more times more likely to be imprisoned than other children, and that the Closing the Gap target to reduce the rate at which Aboriginal children are imprisoned is one of those that is not likely not to be met, and the numbers are going backwards. It's an area of policy concern. As I said, for the foundation, we recently held a policy forum with some experts from overseas about there's different ways we can approach this. We don't need to be punitive. We don't need to have children being on remand for weeks and months. Thank you. So the Don Dunstan Foundation, we exist to continue Don's legacy in many areas of policy and public life, including arts and culture, for which he was very well known. So tonight's topic, Australian culture in a volatile global order, I think would have resonated with Don. He worked for many years to overturn his party's White Australia policy, to ensure that Australia moved towards a non-discriminatory migration policy. He celebrated multiculturalism. He was opposed to the White Australia policy not only because it was racist, but because he believed it was not in Australia's national interests, that we were a country that was essentially saying to neighbouring countries that we didn't view you sufficiently highly to have your people live here. He believed it was that migration contributed greatly to the enrichment of Australia's society, and he loved many countries, Italy, Greece, Malaysia. In the 70s, we had Malaysia Week in Adelaide, which I was only become recently aware of. It's comforting that we have Don's advocacy to look back on, but it's also sobering that many of his arguments are needed in Australian and global politics today. So the questions we're going to ask tonight, and we have some wonderful speakers to help us try and answer them, that in a world of increasing violence and crises, where the international rules-based order we all took for granted suddenly seems to be disappearing, what is the role for culture culture is usually associated with what international relations experts call soft power, the projection of Australian values. But how can culture act in a world of competing geopolitical camps where might is right, realism is on the rise? What might Australia do as a so-called middle power in this international cultural place at a time when overseas aid is being cut, sustainable development is attacked by our key ally, and the globally organised authoritarian right seems intent on destroying liberal progressivism. In this new landscape, are we still part of the West? How do we read China's growing cultural influence? How do we culturally connect with our near neighbours in the Indo-Pacific? How does this relate to our own continent with its 65,000 plus year cultural history? What about South Australia's role? How do we act positively in this changing world? Do we need a new vision for Australian culture in the world? So tonight is going to work like this. We have some wonderful speakers, as I said, to take us through the topic. We'll begin with Tom Chodor, and later we'll hear from Christy Anthony and Luke Dolman. And then all three will be in discussion with Professor Justin O'Connor from Adelaide Uni. So Tom is Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Monash University. He said to me before that he was the token non-cultural academic here tonight. His speciality is international relations. But before joining Monash, Tom was the UQ postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland, and a lecturer in the School of Sociology at the Australian National University. He holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Auckland, Bachelor of Arts Honours and PhD from the Adelaide Australian National University. His research interests are in the areas of international political economy, international relations, and global governance. Please welcome Tom.
Thank you for that, and thanks for inviting me to speak along with this. As I said to Justin earlier, and as the token Polish New Zealander, I'm not sure I'm very well placed to talk about Australian culture at such an event. So I'll stick to my specialty, which is international politics. And my task today, I guess, in this first part of the discussion, is to set the scene, to try to make some sense of what on earth is going on in the international system and where that leaves cultural diplomacy, Australia as a middle power, and so on. So the framing device that we have for today's event, a volatile global order, I think needs not much introduction. If you're unlucky enough to watch the news on a daily basis, you can see what's going on. We can see the never-ending psychodrama that is the Trump administration. We can see multiple wars in the Middle East and Europe, which break all laws of war. We can see trade wars between the US and basically every other country in the world. We can see a rising China reasserting its claims in the South China Sea. We see Europeans racing to rearm and closing their borders at the same time. We see widespread protests against governments all around the world, from India to Bolivia, waves of protests against incumbent governments. What on earth is going on? I think this is what we're all trying to make sense of, all international relations scholars and broader members of the public such as us. And in my discipline, international relations, people that study this for a living, or at least claim to, this is framed as a breakdown of this mythical thing called the rules-based international order. This refers to the international system that emerged after World War II from 1945 onwards, which was based on mutually agreed rules and underpinned by US power and leadership. Get to that point of leadership shortly. Power and leadership, which we can safely say is now waning, or perhaps has passed already. Now, the stakes of such a world order passing for middle powers like Australia are very high. A world without rules is a world, as David said, of might makes right, of a world where, as the Greek scholar Thucydides called it, the strong do as they will and the weak do as they must. So where does this leave us in Australia specifically? So today in this talk, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on what this rules-based international order was, what happened to it, and what it means for countries like Australia. So the rules-based international order is a very wonky academic term which people just tune out as soon as they hear it. I'm going to try to make it interesting for you, or at least legible to a non-academic audience who doesn't sit with books and read about all these sort of things. It's based on the principle that we call multilateralism, which again sounds very elaborate, but actually all it refers to is a system where relations between states proceed through international institutions which function or previously agreed rules that are binding on everyone. So importantly, it's a form of relation based on rules. Importantly, these rules are negotiated among states. They know that rather than being simply imposed by the most powerful, they involve compromises, making them mutually beneficial, and they're also universal. In theory, they're open to anyone. Anyone who wants to sign up to these rules can join the system and be part of and be bound by these rules. Now, if you know your history, such a system is quite an unusual thing to happen. Usually, might is right throughout history. We can point to many examples. But such a system emerges after World War II in very specific historical conditions. The first of these is what we call in international relations US hegemony, which is a form of rule that relies more on consent than coercion. After World War II, the United States emerges as the most powerful nation in history. It accounts for half the global economic output, has a very advanced and very powerful military. It is essentially a new term is invented to describe the US as a superpower, something that hasn't existed before, with the power to shape the world according to its interests. But importantly, the US is not the only superpower in 1945. It is faced by the USSR, the Soviet Union, which is perhaps not as powerful, but its industrial development and communist ideology give it a lot of influence throughout the world, especially where there are strong communist movements and parties, often which were quite crucial to the defeat of the Nazis throughout the world. Therefore, the international system after World War II is defined by what we now know as the Cold War, where two superpowers compete to promote their respective political and economic models and try to pull other states into its orbit, especially newly independent states that are emerging out of the fall of Western empires throughout the world. This Cold War is the second crucial dimension for a rules-based international order. Rather than simply impose its will, like it could because it was a superpower, the US sets up a series of institutions, ones that we know, like the United Nations, ones that are less known, like the GATT, the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and so on. And the rules within these institutions promote American interests and the American economic model. But also importantly, they offer concessions and compromises to other states in order to win them over in this Cold War contest. For example, the GATT promotes trade liberalization, the slow lowering of barriers to trade, specifically tariffs and other non-tariff barriers. And the US leads the way in this, opening its market to other countries' exports, but also pressuring other countries to open their markets to American exports. And it's no coincidence that American companies are obviously the most advanced at this stage because they've suffered the least out of the war. But within this push within this institution to reduce barriers to trade, to promote rules-based trade, these rules, which are meant to promote trade liberalization, often offer, I should say, a number of safeguards that are negotiated to other countries, allowing them to restrict free trade in events of economic crisis, to protect things like full employment, to prevent abuses of trade by other countries ruining their own economies. These are concessions that the US offers to European nations which are ravaged by war and the Great Depression, often with very strong communist movements in their societies, and they don't just want to open their economies and have their industries go even into further chaos. So they push the United States, and the United States agrees to compromise on these sort of trade rules. There are similar rules in finance, investment, security, development, all sorts of areas in the international system, all of which advance American interests, but do so also by granting other states sufficient concessions and compromises to win their consent for the US leadership of the world order. Therefore, American power after World War II is tempered through multilateral rules. That's what the rules-based international order was. The US is forced to compromise because of the Soviet threat. And it's something that, never let it be said, I thought I'd be saying, we are Mr. Soviet Union, but that is one thing the Soviet Union certainly was good for in tempering American power. Now, admittedly, these rules, this is a rose-tinted view of what happened to an extent. These rules didn't apply to everyone equally. Specifically, developing countries, what was then known as the Third World, often didn't get much say in the drafting of these rules, and they didn't advance the development aspirations that many of these countries had emerging out of centuries of colonialism in some cases. Yet the mere existence of a rules-based international order implied an opportunity to negotiate concessions from the hegemon, from the dominant power, and the post-World War II order was characterized by this back and forth, by contestation between North and South, First and Third World, over the exact meaning and content of these rules. But they were rules that everyone agreed on, that everyone wanted to be part of. Now, Australia was a key player in this process. You'll be pleased to know it played a leading role in the founding of the United Nations and was a very active participant in many of its institutions. And that's generally the story that's told about Australian heritage, Australian history. But we should also have no qualms about admitting that Australia had no issue in breaking international rules when it suited it, or more importantly, when it suited its American ally. The Vietnam War is just one example of that sort of situation. Okay, nevertheless, despite occasional defection from these rules by the hegemon and some of its allies, Australia included, overall, this system worked surprisingly well. And after 2 world wars and a Great Depression, and a threat of nuclear holocaust, that's nothing to sneeze at, I think. The rules-based international order that emerges after World War II brought unprecedented prosperity and stability and gave us rise to things that we take for granted now, like the middle class, which was not really a thing that existed. Like stable, prosperous societies that we hear from our parents about, that supposedly still existed back then. Now, this international order emerges after World War II. It experiences a period of crisis in the 1970s when its economic model, which relies on a strong role for the state, for governments to regulate capital, both domestically and internationally, often through these rules, exactly as I said, they allow states to put restrictions on the movement of investment between countries, on free trade, and so on. But this system runs out of steam by the 1970s for a variety of reasons that we don't have to necessarily get into. This crisis is resolved in the 1980s with the United States adopting a new economic model that departs from this state-driven system to what we now know as neoliberalism or economic rationalism in Australia, which essentially is an embrace of free markets and the free movement of capital. So we go from states being allowed to control the movement of capital and to regulate and take part in economic activity to letting the market rip, essentially, as we put it. Under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, the US rewrote the rules of the rules-based international order to instead promote neoliberalism, reviving successfully, as a result, reviving economic growth and enabling what we now call globalization. That was sort of another thing we take for granted. Now, this was certainly a contentious process. This was a lot of fighting, a lot of struggle throughout the 1980s to implement such policies and to rewrite all these institutions which were committed to protection of societies from economic forces. But most states ended up accepting this as this being in their interest. And we can witness our own replace of neoliberalism in Australia under the Hawke and Keating governments. Essentially, most governments accepted that there was no alternative to such an embrace of the market in a globalizing world economy. Now, this embrace of this market and globalization was much easier because of the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991. This not only seemingly vindicated the American model, but it also meant that the US was under less pressure to offer concessions to other states. This was, if you're lucky enough to read the global governance literature from the 1990s, there's a lot of worry about America being basically telling other countries this is the American way or the highway. But the end of the Cold War was nevertheless seen as a triumph of the rules-based international order and of American leadership of it. It was also seen as an opportunity to finally universalize this model. This was a model that was largely confined to the Western Bloc, the American bloc, with developing countries playing an ambiguous role within it. But once different blocs collapsed and once we had a flat world of globalization, this was a model that extended to include all countries, previously excluded from it, whether because they were part of the Second World or whether because they were part of the developing world and holding out against it. This gave rise to a great hope of a new era of international cooperation, of what was called at the time the global village, where nations would coalesce around liberal market, democracy, and cosmopolitanism to the benefit of all. Essentially, they would all converge on some sort of global culture and global rules that we all accepted, and this would be great for everyone. Australia, again, was an active player in this process. It very vigorously joined new institutions like the World Trade Organizations and APEC. It was a peacekeeper in East Timor under UN mandates with this new sort of desire to prevent humanitarian atrocities happening. But also, it was not averse, again, to breaking international law, as we know, when the hegemon demanded it, as we saw with the Iraq War in 2003. Yet, despite these hopes that we would have this great village, great global village where everything would work out great and we all would live happily ever after, the rules-based international order is now in crisis. Why? This is something that we're all grappling with, and there are plenty of explanations, but I'm going to give you mine. I'm going to give you one that I think is probably the most plausible. And it's a simple, in a way, it's a simple answer to why are we seeing this chaos? Why are we seeing this abandonment of international rules and norms that we've sort of come to take for granted? Simply put, the conjuncture that made the rules-based international order possible is no longer in place. We're entering a new historical conjuncture, which leads nation-states and other actors towards different types of actions. Firstly, the US is no longer willing or able to play a hegemonic role like it did after World War II. So the US is no longer a hegemon. It is no longer a hegemon in the sense that it offers leadership as well as domination. And the reasons for this are closely related to its own hegemony and its rules-based international order itself. Simply put, the neoliberal economic model that the US has been promoting since the 1980s through these global institutions, through these rules, may have benefited US capital, and it certainly did benefit many US companies, but it was less beneficial to American citizens. Now, there are well-documented problems of deindustrialization, of stagnant wages, of growing inequality, deaths of despair, all that sort of stuff that we can read about in the news, as US companies have moved elsewhere, and the US market has been flooded with cheap imports from around the world, leading to the loss of jobs and livelihoods. This is referred to as the China shock in the US. This, from an international relations perspective, is the cost of hegemony. The US has been, since 1945, the consumer of last resort, keeping its economy open to other nations' exports, even if it meant that its own domestic industries couldn't compete. Now, the consequences of this for American citizens, American workers, finally came to a head in 2008 during the global financial crisis, and have continued festering ever since, leading eventually to the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. And as one thing we know about Donald Trump is that he prefers a more transactional approach, should we say, with little interest in compromise and concessions. Instead, he's very much committed to America first, or at least how he defines America first. Now, for international relations theorists, this is not surprising. Eventually, every hegemon will fall, according to IR theory, because the costs of hegemony eventually will outweigh the benefits of hegemony, leading to demands from population for domestic protection rather than foreign concessions. The US now is just a normal power, using its still very considerable weight in the international system, the global economy, international institutions, to advance its narrow interests at the expense of others, including its allies. We can see with Australia experiencing Trump's tariffs recently and in previous years. Yet, while the hegemon has abdicated, while the US is no longer willing and interested in playing such a leadership role, there's no alternative that's emerging. Despite expectations of some, China is uninterested in global hegemony, and its relations with other states are often purely transactional. China's Belt and Road initiatives may build you a railway, or Chinese companies may move to your country, to your shores and manufacture you some solar panels. But the Chinese market and Chinese economy is still relatively closed to imports. It doesn't absorb imports from other countries in the way that the US did for almost a century. And when you can't pay your debts to Chinese banks, they're not very willing to give you debt forgiveness, as a number of African countries are finding out in recent years due to the debt crisis. So there is no alternative emerging. There's no new hegemon emerging. With no hegemon, the international system is instead characterized by multiple competing powers with no one in charge. We may call this an apolar world, where no one state is willing or able to put forward a compelling political economic project and offer concessions and compromises to try to win other states and other actors through this project. Instead, it's every state for itself. Okay, what does this mean for the rules-based international order? As I suggested, I think we need to recognize that these structural conditions that made the rules-based international order possible, that we took for granted, are actually no longer holding, and there is no going back to the good old days. But whatever we make of the current moment, it's only going to get probably worse or better, depending how you view it, but we're not going to go back. This means that existing institutions that we also take for granted are not only relics of a bygone age, meaning they often don't function, they're not very efficient because states no longer support them. But more importantly, they're actually obstacles to the pursuit of geopolitical interests of major powers. Obstacles will need to be sabotaged, abandoned, bypassed, or diverted towards serving more narrow interests. This reality, I think, helps us to understand recent developments in international relations, things like US sabotaging the WTO and trade rules, Europeans' gutting of aid and sustainable development budgets, Israel's renunciation of the rules of war. For many powers, international rules are no longer the mean, for many powers, international rules are no longer the means for mutually beneficial cooperation, but rather constraints that need to be overcome. Therefore, the days of the strong being constrained by rules are gone, at least for now. On a joyful note, what does this leave Australia? To set us up for a very positive discussion. Now, as a middle power, Australia obviously is very conscious of the benefits of a rules-based order, rather than being at the mercy of powerful states, even if it's very good at closing up to powerful states. In recent years has seen a concerted diplomatic effort from the Australian government to shore up the existing order under assault, to still try to keep it going because it still benefits Australia. We've seen a flurry of multilateral initiatives, for example, a new ad hoc trade dispute body that tries to preserve some of the rules-based trade that exists in the WTO. New principles designed to protect humanitarian workers at the UN, which Penny Wong launched last year. Likewise, bilaterally, Australia has been cultivating alliances with other middle powers, other states, to try to pursue common goals amongst themselves without having to rely on these powerful states. Witness the Prime Minister's frequent trips to rising powers in the region like Indonesia, Vietnam, Korea, and so on. Also, recent enhanced cooperation with countries like Canada on things like critical minerals. Canada's further ahead in this and realizing that we need to have a different approach to the international system. Cultural diplomacy, I think, if I can give a shout out here, is crucial to this process, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from the panel about how it features in it. But clearly, forming relationships with other states, and more importantly, with other state societies, makes it much easier to cultivate and maintain these relationships with this more diverse array of allies. But we shouldn't be sanguine about our prospects of succeeding in this, and no one ever accused me of being an optimist, so I'm going to give you the 3 reasons for pessimism and 3 obstacles to this actually succeeding. Firstly, while Australia can build up alternative institutions and alliances and can try to get out of the shadow of these warring hegemons and dominant powers, it is still at their mercy. Great powers can still undermine institutions and alliances if they don't approve of them. For example, look at US treatments of Canada in recent years, especially after Mark Carney came to power, as it attempted to build a more balanced relationship with China. That was a step too far for the US and has been trying to undermine that ever since. In short, we can have our own attempts to ward ourselves off from the great powers, but we're not going to get away from them. They're still going to be there. Speaking of great powers, Australia is not an innocent bystander in this assault on the rules-based international order. Australia is and remains committed to US primacy through things like AUKUS. Therefore, we are implicated in America's assault on the very rules that we claim to uphold, complicating our efforts to build up alliances, especially with powers in the region, which rightly see AUKUS as what it is, an attempt to constrain China, which is also something that most states in the region have no interest in doing. They want to have good relations with both. They do not want to be roped into an effort to try to bring down China or contain it. So the question then is, can Australia think for itself? Can it think strategically and autonomously to try to develop new ways of seeing the world and new ways of seeing its own region, especially at a time when its great and powerful friend is the biggest source of instability in the international system? I think the jury remains out on that one, but I'm keen to hear what everyone else thinks. Finally, to finish, Australia as itself is not immune from these political forces trying to tear down the rules-based international order. What Australia did relatively well out of neoliberalism and free trade, we have also experienced our own share of the sort of malaise that we see in other countries, of deindustrialization, of stagnating wages, of inequality, of decline of trust in democracy and a feeling like the social contract has been torn up. These forces drive populism elsewhere, and they drive it in Australia too. Pauline Hanson's recent rise is a result of these forces becoming more prominent in Australia. Now, Prime Minister Pauline still seems a far-fetched idea, but never rule it out. Stranger things have happened. But even without that, these political forces that are shaping, that are powering Pauline Hanson's and One Nation's rise are shaping our politics nevertheless. shifting the Overton window towards these type of policies seen elsewhere, not only on the right, but also on the left. Witness the ALP's recent stances on migration and international students, which wouldn't be out of place in some European countries, also with populist parties. As these forces shape our politics, we need to ask, not only will Australia continue to see the rules-based international order to be in our interest, but more importantly, if we do, what type of Australian culture will we have to draw on to try to sustain it with our allies in the region, if this is our politics now? On that joyful note, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yes, sit down, Tom. So thanks for that. That's a great overview of a not very pleasant landscape, but nevertheless, there we are. So I wanted to just do a seg from the hardcore of international politics. I was where thinking about culture. Stalin's famous phrase. How many divisions has the Pope? What's culture got to do with it? And so I thought I'd introduce it just by saying just a couple of minutes about what the situation is in Europe, because I've been in Europe for a month and been working with a few European agencies around this. And this is a terrible shorthand, but in many respects, the European Union is a child of the rules-based international order. I mean, it grew up under the American umbrella, of course. I mean, it was set up for also, we don't have to go into the details. It was set up as a counterweight to the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and it's been for a long time it's been under its protection, and of course that's been taken away now. The European Union sees itself as built on rules, and in fact, many of the critiques of the EU from the UK, and I followed the debates around Brexit. But it's you want to straighten our bananas. It's over-regulation. It's controlling all this kind of thing. Bureaucrats in Brussels. So in many ways, it's deeply imbued with this idea of a rules-based order. So, of course, in both senses, obviously, what's happened with Trump walking away from, in many respects, from a blank check for European protection, and this uprooting of the rules, this breaking of the rules, this dissing of the rules, it's deeply affected that sense of where Europe is on that in all sorts of ways. And my interest, of course, was in culture. And I should say this is kind of slightly technocratic, as you might think. But although we talk about Europe, there are European nations, of course, France and Germany, etc., etc. But the EU is a distinct combination of these 27 nations. And while the European nations have their own cultural diplomacy, which I'll come on to in a minute, the EU has been developing, certainly since the turn of the millennium, been developing its own kind of cultural policy. It's not allowed to in many respects. It's supposed to defer to the nation states. It's not really got power over culture, but nonetheless, it's been developing a cultural policy over the last years. And at first it was very much about, in the late 90s and in the early millennium, with the accession of so many new countries, it was very much about European identity, how to promote European identity. And this goes back to the 80s, European national anthems, European flags, all this kind of thing. More recently, that hit a wall in around just before the GFC, when many European countries refused the rule change. It got rejected in many referenda, but they switched around the GFC time to economic justifications. So we get the growth of creative industries in Europe, the competitive powerhouse, and all this kind of thing. More after the GFC, it was very much about democracy and, or rather, resilience and those kind of things. So there's been a whole range of different things. But what's happened, I think, over the last since Trump, and certainly since Trump 2.0, has been a real shift to rethinking culture in general terms as a bastion of democracy. And this can go either way. It can be, I think, it can be a regressive or a progressive vision of it. You know, it can be fortress Europe defending our values, or it can be something more open. So, but it's most recently the cultural compass. They launched what they call a cultural compass, which is more or less an EU's cultural vision, cultural strategic vision. And the economic dimension is very downplayed in it. There's one line in it, but of the 12 or 13 kind of main strands, it's about democracy, it's about artistic freedom, it's about the working conditions of artists. It's a very kind of progressive view of what culture does, and it ends up by talking that, you know, Europe for culture and culture for Europe. It really puts culture at the heart of the European project. And so on one of those lines is that it's really going to promote the idea of international cultural relations, i.e. that somehow the EU itself has relations with the outside world. And I think it's important here to make some distinctions, and they're not hard and fast in any way. But a lot of people talk about cultural diplomacy, which is traditionally an arm of public diplomacy. So states, you know, the Australian government or the Brussels or France or Germany, the German government, try to promote, they pursue their diplomatic ends through culture, which is usually on the benign end of things. It's kind of nation branding, building connections, making trade, smoothing trade. You know, you send an opera company over to smooth relations that might have economic benefits or just general diplomatic benefits. So there's public diplomacy. And this has often been linked to soft power. So the idea that a slightly more diffuse way of presenting the nation in a good light, so that hopefully it can help you get what you want in international affairs. So it's a kind of a softer version of public diplomacy. But more recently, certainly since the last decade, a term has been used called international cultural relations, which again is seen to be much less state-directed, but more an attribute of usually arm's length bodies, arm's length projects that aim to connect cultural institutions, artists, and publics as well, connect them at a much more bottom-up kind of flatter level. So they're not directed by the states necessarily, but they try to make connections with other people and partnerships and collaborations. And this is something that the EU is really keen to do. Now, it's doing that in a situation of great, well, as Thomas has outlined very clearly, at a moment of great volatility. And what it's asking itself is, in trying to promote these more flatter, more equitable, more collaborative culture relations with, you know, Africa, with the Middle East, with Latin America and other places, in doing that, what are we trying to do? What values are we trying to present to the world? What is this Europe? What is this European project that somehow is encapsulated or helped along by this valuing of a certain form of culture? So that's the EU. Of course, the individual countries, the different nation states still pursue their cultural projects through the Alliance Française or the Goethe Institute and it's not the EU, but the British have the British Council. So there are many of those institutions working at the nation state level. But here's the EU trying to talk about international cultural relations, these flatter, more bottom-up connections, and it's they're thinking, as I say, about how do we present Europe, the EU, in this new kind of world. So that was the background to wanting to talk about, well, where's Australia in this? If the world has changed so radically, and this international rules-based order that we kind of go along with or have gone along with, if that is clearly not working anymore, it's clearly in serious trouble, then, as Tom asked, where's Australia in the world, but also where's Australian culture in the world? And what kind of rethink should it engage in? So with that in mind, I was wanting to pass over to Chrissy Anthony and Luke, who will come up now. Chrissy Anthony you all know, it's a well-known figure in Adelaide and South Australia and beyond. A friend of Baroness Mackenzie, but yes, so Chrissy will be known to many of you as you were head of culture at Adelaide City Council for many years, deeply involved in the Adelaide Festival Centre, and if more recently in Country Arts, I believe, SA Country Arts, yes. So she'll speak to us, and then we'll pass over to Luke Dolman, who is, again, deeply versed in cultural diplomacy, actions around cultural diplomacy through classical music, I believe. You can say more about that. In tours and all sorts of those kind of actual work of doing the cultural work overseas. And now, of course, is the Dean of International Engagement at Adelaide University. So Chrissy and Luke are going to just say a few words, and then we'll try and have a discussion.
Thank you, Justin. So my field of interest is arts organisations and festivals. So I want to now sort of talk about their role in the volatile global order. And thank you for that. It was enlightening and terrifying. So to do that, though, I'm going to take you back to another volatile global time, because I think it's interesting to look back on what happened in this initial purpose of two of the most established festivals in the world. So the Edinburgh International Festival was founded in 1947, after the aftermath of the Second World War, when all this kicked off, clearly, and we tried to put in rules everywhere. But from a cultural perspective, there was a belief that culture could deeply heal nations and rebuild relationships and create understanding where politics has failed. It was an early act of cultural diplomacy, demonstrating that arts could foster peace and international goodwill by bringing together, through shared artistic experiences, people from all over the world. It was clear that the Scots believed that culture could achieve what diplomacy alone could not, rebuilding trust, fostering dialogue and reconnecting nations after the devastation of war. So it demonstrated that artistic exchange could be a powerful instrument to international relations. Then 13 years later, here in Adelaide, we embraced that same vision, establishing the International Festival of Arts in South Australia and Australia as an outwardly looking, cultural, confident nation connected to the world. So from its inception, the Adelaide Festival was a statement that could build international relationships and enhance our global reputation and strengthen Australia's place on the world stage. There's no question that understanding that work coming from the world to us would give us an understanding, a better and greater understanding of other cultures, and keep the peace. But most recently, I have had the privilege of working with Douglas Gautier, AM, as the CEO of the Adelaide Festival Centre, where he was for 18 years. I don't think he's here, but I do want to acknowledge him because his focus almost solely alone in Australia was on building relationships with Asia through culture and with a deep belief that arts will connect us and prosper us from a social perspective first and economics to follow. So Douglas he actually initiated AusAsia Festival, which was really unique and a first of its kind in Australia at the time. And it was a contemporary model of cultural diplomacy, strengthening our relationship with the Indo-Pacific. He invited artists from Southeast Asia and collaborated with Australian artists, and most recently there was a real focus on Asian Australian artists because, of course, you know, we have such a huge population of Asian Australians now, to deliberately shining a spotlight on this region and moving us away from our colonial European models, which, you know, ensuring Australian voices are heard and faces are seen on our main stages. And I would suggest that during this time, the Adelaide Festival Centre, and in particular Douglas, our closest government relationships were actually with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Federal Ministry for Foreign Affairs, more so than the Departments of Culture and the Arts, particularly because the federal cultural departments don't fund art centres for a start. But there was the number of cultural missions and diplomatic activity we did was phenomenal, and our relationship with Minister Wong at the time was actually honoured with a huge portrait that we put up in the Festival Centre for her, deliberately, strategically. There were massive diplomatic missions, such as, and I'll just touch on one, bringing the Shandong National Theatre Company from China. For the first time ever, a Chinese theatre company had come out of China to any country in the world, and landed here on our stage, which was at the time pretty hilarious. They didn't really fit. The show was enormous, but there were more politicians and diplomats and so on in the audience than we'd ever seen in Adelaide. It was a moment where it seemed unbelievably important. It was an eye-opening performance as well, and I learned a lot because I didn't fully appreciate the piece itself. I still don't understand it, but there's no question it was used to showcase, you know, the goodwill and interest. And today, the relationship of South Australia with Shandong from a trade perspective and also a cultural, you know, we're a friendly city, etc., is enormous. And this was really based on personal relationships that reached out and connected. And it's still one of the strongest today. So there were more informal and yet arguably far-reaching expressions of cultural diplomacy through the festival's public program. But now, and still, things like the Lucky Dumpling Market, not just bringing big companies out, but also focusing on other cultural elements of the region, has attracted thousands of people who have now, you know, shared experiences of Asia and rubbed shoulders with K-pop artists and so on, which have engaged with cultures of our region in an accessible and celebratory way. And in this context, cultural diplomacy occurs not through formal exchanges alone, but through everyday encounters. So there's no question in my mind that culture is one of Australia's most powerful forms of international engagement. And to get to a point of what our role could be, I think Australia needs a renewed understanding of these opportunities. So rather than seeing culture as simply a projection of Australia's values, who are we as still a colonised state, or as an instrument of national branding, such as many of the other Alliance Française do and so on, I think we should see it as infrastructure for dialogue. At its best, cultural exchange that doesn't tell people who we are, but it creates opportunities to discover who we can be together, particularly with our region, to firm up relationships with our regional neighbours and create cultural exchange because it's the strongest form of diplomacy. There's my thoughts.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chrissy. So I'm a practitioner, I'm a musician. I've been a musician for most of my life. In a certain point in my career, I moved to Europe, studied in Helsinki, and then sort of worked around different parts of Europe as an orchestral conductor, which was a great part of my life. Really enjoyed the experience. And as I progressed in that career, being an Australian, of course, it occurred to me that I should promote Australian music and where I can work with Australian musicians. And I didn't really think of that as being cultural diplomacy or cultural relations at that point of time. It just seemed like a really natural thing to be doing. As I moved back to Australia and then started working at the former University of Adelaide in 2016, I gradually became more and more involved in sort of more formal cultural diplomacy projects, if you like. And I've done a number of projects particularly in China, Singapore, but other parts of Asia as well, that have been supported by the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, the Australia-Singapore Arts Group, and other parts of government, embassies, consulates, etc. And this has led me to think more deeply about what cultural diplomacy can be and what we can aspire to in the future as a nation. And one of the really interesting things for me has been the development of my own ideas of we talked about Australian values. What do we mean by that exactly? And what exactly do we want to take overseas? What are the values we want to project? And I think that's a really interesting question. And Christy talked about a culturally confident nation. And I'd question that actually. Are we a culturally confident nation? I don't think we're there yet. And there are reasons for that, of course. But we've got a long way to go, I think. And it's very easy for cultural diplomacy projects to be tokenistic and shallow. And I've seen many projects over the years along those lines. And I've been involved in some as well. So to really reflect modern Australia is a challenge, and to actually really engender genuine dialogue, particularly we're talking about diplomacy in terms of statecraft and how we move our own nation's interests forwards. How do we really do that on a deep level through cultural diplomacy in a way that has long-term impact? And it's not just a nice night out for everybody. We hear some, instrumentalists from different countries play together, and it's lovely. But then everybody goes home, and there's no follow-up. It's an area I really love working with. I love working with people from other cultures. It's one of my favourite things to do. One of my aspirations as an artist is to do these projects better going forwards. We've had some good starts. We did a really great project I'm proud of in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, where we worked with some musicians from CASM, our Centre for Aboriginal Studies and Music here at Adelaide University. And we worked together with Will Barton, and we went over and worked with the Hong Kong Sinfonietta. Developed a new work together with a Shang player called Lo Si Wang, and that was presented in Hong Kong, but we wrapped up the whole project with other elements as well. We went to universities and did lectures. We went to high schools. We did a symposium at Taekwondo Arts to sort of talk more broadly about the relationship between our countries and to give the whole thing a bit more of a context. And I think, certainly the projects I have in mind for the future take all of that and take it further. One of the other things I'd like to highlight is what Christy mentioned, just in terms of also, our multiculturalism. It's with the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. It's great to see in the last few years they've started to also, as well as emphasising the importance of First Nations culture, which is absolutely right and should be central to what we're doing, but also talking about the Chinese Australian community and how important they are. And whenever I travel in China, people are astounded that we have Chinese musicians here in Adelaide, that the university has a traditional Chinese orchestra. They really value that. So these are things we can celebrate and, take overseas as well. So, it's a really interesting topic. I'm really glad we're talking about it. And, there's certainly a lot to talk about.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask, both of you really, that was a great phrase. You had that really it's cultural diplomacy should be seen as an infrastructure for dialogue, or cultural dialogue. And I suppose the question is, do we have that infrastructure now in Australia, and what might it look like?
Well, you're quite right. I think that depending on, in terms of organisations and funding and models to create those things, no. I would say that Douglas Gautier was it is still doing that on his own out there quite a lot. There is funding opportunities through the Australia Council, and there are there are a number of foundations that are supporting international exchanges, but I think that it's not led as an opportunity that's extremely obvious to every company. We're still looking to create work here in Australia for Australians in the first instance. There are so many examples of when artists have come, and I know that exchanges are short and and happen and everyone goes home again, but I generally think they have long-lasting impact on both parties because of the natural exchange that happens when you meet people directly and work together in real time, as we're alive today. So there aren't enough organisations whose job it is to create this environment. The Australia Council does a little of it, but it has a bigger object. And I don't think DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, they encourage it and they support Douglas and they put him on every panel you can think of, but there's no mechanism where culture is, there's a door open for it that I'm aware of.
I mean, do we, the obvious question, do we need a British Council, a Institut Français, a Goethe Institute for Australia?
I think that's a wonderful idea, and I totally agree with Christy that in terms of infrastructure, it seems like there's no real clear national strategy right now. Certainly, if you look at the DFAT grants that are available through various foundations, I've mentioned the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. There's also the Maitri grants for India relations. They're the two significant ones that do have good levels of funding, but there's a whole suite of other foundations that are honestly really poorly funded. There's also a cultural diplomacy grant that you can apply for, but it's very small and there's not much money in the bucket. So it does feel like there's not a coherent national strategy around this at the moment.
I mean, why might that be? Given Australia's position in, and its claims to multiculturalism, its pivot to Asia that I suppose Paul Keating attempted anyway in that sense.
Could it be, Justin, that artists are dangerous? You just can't trust them. They might change the world.
Well, I don't know.
Is it complacency? I think that part of the story is complacency about, wow, we're a prosperous nation in the fast rising region. Paul Keating did all the hard work in the 1990s. We have Asian Australians, we have Chinese Australians, we have all these sort of things. So she'll be right. But actually, I think if I'm going to bring my pessimism into it, we haven't quite caught on to the fact that the world is changing, and that actually this requires a lot of hard work and resources, which we're always very very unwilling to spend.
It also takes brave politicians, sadly, right now, still to really fly the flag of culture as at the forefront. It's not something that they see by way of a trade negotiation, and as perhaps as a door opener and maybe nice to have, but not as a lead. And I think it's misunderstood in that regard, because the lead of relations that can be made and the deep understanding from experiencing other cultures is phenomenal. So rather than complacency, probably a little fear because of the way we are, where culture sits at the moment. It's it's not something that any particular politician is flying the flag for. We don't have it on Dunstan right now.
I think there's also an attitude, if you like, that still for some, I think that culture is something that's imported rather than exported. And yet, as I mentioned previously, we're still developing if you like, our own Australian cultural identity. And just in terms of our relationships with Asia, it seems to me that, we've only really been striving for genuine engagement with Asia probably since the 1980s, which is still relatively recently. And that's still something that's growing. And prior to that, it wouldn't occur to people to export culture to Europe, for example, because for us, culture arrives on QF1 from London sometimes. So, yeah, I think there's yeah, a long way to travel there. But cultural diplomacy, I think, has a really strong place to play in terms of our engagement with Asia. And there's so many, intersections we can explore throughout both China and Southeast Asia.
I want to know what you think, Justin. Can I ask you? What do you think? Why do you think we don't have in Australia British Council equivalent?
Well, for just some basic facts, we all know the gradual decline of federal funding for the arts. So it's clearly dropping off. It's been cut, and many of the states are cutting funding, either absolutely or relatively. So somehow the cultural funding is seen as not a priority. But also you link that to overseas aid, and Australia's aid contribution. I think it peaked in about 2012, but since then it's been in decline, and it's the bottom a third of the OECD countries in terms of foreign aid. So but that's, I think you mentioned the same in Europe as well. Many, and of course America, is cutting foreign aid. So there's a decline in that in the importance of culture internally. Why not externally? It's very. I actually don't know why. It seems such an obvious and simple step. It can be as much lip service and superficial as you want, but it seems to be an obvious thing. And I go around, I used to do some work for UNESCO and things. I go around conferences and things. Australian culture is absent from those, certainly global cultural policy conferences. It's more prevalent in UNESCO cities, usually cities of culture. But it lacks a certain level of clout because there's no organisation kind of making that claim. You don't think, they're not there at the table. The other thing that strikes me is that Australia has been for a long time a net importer of culture. As in commercial culture, and that's got even worse now. So we local offices of Spotify and Netflix, and we do not make our own popular culture anymore. So I think in the 1980s, going through the 1990s, Australia was a powerhouse of popular culture, not just popular culture, and of, if you like, really, really strong, marked but dramatic, powerful, confident, up yours kind of culture in all sorts of levels, from high culture to, if you like, want to call it that, to popular culture, and that ended. And I don't know why that ended, but certainly there's that sense that we now import culture, as we all know. The Australian cultural sector is not in control of its own means of production anymore. So we've got the kind of, I suppose what I'm saying is the government doesn't protect culture within its borders. So why would it start to export it or provide it outside its borders in that concerted way? The two are connected, I think.
Yeah, fair. And I think also all of our cultural policies, from the federal to the state to the local government level, does lead with First Nations first. But this is new, a trend. Thankfully, we're there, and the majority of funding and resources needs to consider, in the first instance, Australian Aboriginal cultural storytelling and production of work. And I think we've still got a long way to go there, obviously, to build a body of work that is truly Australian. We're not. It's going to take a lot longer to fund and develop really excellent work that's ready to tour around Australia and locally, and is and wants to, frankly, lead Australian cultural identity, because there's a bigger conversation there about where we are as what Australian culture is anyway.
Well, maybe I can ask questions that kind of big geopolitical ones in that sense. And two examples, and I'll come back to the First Nations example in a minute, and especially in light of what David said at the very beginning. But the first one would be, for example, the growth of Asia connections, especially with China exchanges. But at some point, probably 2018, 2019, I presume, at the word of the US, Australia rapidly and quite violently moved against China. There was, think of the Confucius Institutes, everybody was doing this. And then in the news, we heard stories about, Chinese spies, Chinese influence, the role of the Chinese Communist Party, Confucius Center. And suddenly, the ice formed. So the first question, how does cultural diplomacy work when diplomacy has decided, no, China's the enemy there?
I think one of the strengths of cultural diplomacy is that it can work in good times and bad. And you can look at examples of, for example, the US sending jazz musicians on tour in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which I'm not sure if they particularly appreciated, but those musicians were very honest about their experiences in the US and gave a sort of more meaningful reflection of what the USA was at that time, particularly in terms of race relations, and Cuba and the US in more recent times also. So that is one of the strengths of cultural diplomacy, particularly with music, the art form I work in, it can be political if you want it to be, but it can also be toned down and be apolitical and something that, everybody from every culture can relate to and enjoy.
I gave you a shiny example of, the Shandong National Theatre coming here, all lovely. But during AusAsia, we also had a number of shows which we knew would raise the ire of the Chinese government. There were shows from Chinese artists that cannot be done in China and that have actively been tried to stop being performed. And we had to do risk assessments around them for the protection of the artist, to make sure there was genuine, safety elements. It's not... We can't be naive about that, about the fact that, if you are presenting work, there are... we were in Australia, we don't expect anything serious to happen, but we just don't know what might happen because that artist is doing things that genuinely are, diplomatically dangerous for them. But it's important for Australian audiences to see that as much as it is to see Chinese culture the way in which Chinese government want it to be promoted and what's going on in China now. So it's volatile, seriously volatile. We can't, that's why we need to work with our diplomatic and foreign affairs people to learn about what happens and so on. I mean, recently there's this touring promotional show of what's it called, Shenyang, the dance company that's American and not encouraged, not liked by the Chinese government, and there were bomb threats. This is the one that that actually evacuated. So art does occasionally create massive cultural issues, but it went ahead here in South Australia. We were in Adelaide. We thought, should we cancel this show? Will we get a bomb threat? The bomb threats were coming by email, so it was easy to kind of control, but it's serious. You don't take any risks at all. I mean, bomb threats are no fun. And we went into the show knowing that people had bought tickets. It was, it wasn't a curated show. It was a venue hire. So it's, the quality of the show is what it is. But it went ahead in Adelaide with no trouble. But it did get threats in 3 other states, and 2 of them had to cancel the show. So, and this was 4 months ago. So there's a level at which we need to be. I think absolutely engaging with our region at every level, but we also need to be presenting work that wouldn't otherwise won't happen in those regions, to make sure we're aware fully of what artists are telling us.
Yeah, I think what that highlights, I guess, to go to your original question of why Australia doesn't do this, the sort of cultural diplomacy that prominently is that it's actually quite difficult to have it done by governments, right? It's difficult if you're too close to the government because then you are just seen to be doing the government's bidding. Ideally, cultural diplomacy, I imagine, and soft power, as we would call it, happens on its own. Like it creates a force of attraction, but because it is seen as to be independent of government, it is just, how we do music, how we do art. And other people go, oh, that's really cool. I like that, or I find that attractive. So there's a whole infrastructure of dialogue, as you said, but there's also, I think, just the power of attraction. But the resources for that need to come from somewhere, and they don't really in Australia. They don't really come from private, endowments and so on. Dunstan Foundation, notwithstanding, but they don't really come from private sources. So we rely on government much more so. But there's a danger in being captured by government, which is, once we get talking about cultural diplomacy, we are doing something for the government. It is not just out of the goodness of Australia's heart. We're going to send all these, cultural attaches there. There's actually something else going on, and it's a very fine balance to tread, I think.
That's why arts organisations do need funding through the government, but also need to have an independent arm's length. And, I've just taken on the chairship of country arts on the basis that it is a state, and I'd like to acknowledge Anthony Peluso, the CEO in the room, funded organisation. It's a statutory authority. It's actually, owned by the government, but it needs an independent board, someone, a board of people who are prepared to enable the organisation to do that soft diplomacy, to do what it will, to tell the stories that, and let the government step back and trust us. And we will work closely with them around the risks of where real risks and danger it comes into play for the safety of everybody, but absolutely encourage all stories to be told.
Yeah, the intersection of art and power is dangerous. And when does it lean into propaganda? Of course, that's part of the issue. I have to say, in the DFAT supported projects I've been involved with, they've had a good balance, I think, and stayed pretty much in the background. They've been present, but not too present. But when you mentioned the idea of us setting up the equivalent to the British Council or whatever, certainly those British Council, Goethe Institute, Alliance Française have been deliberately set up to be at least a certain distance from government, which is a really positive thing.
But I think if we look at developments elsewhere, they're tending in the other direction, aren't they? I mean, obviously, again, the US is an extreme version of everything, but one of the things that the Trump administration has been doing is trying to capture these cultural institutions and make them partisan and not at arm's length. And I think if we think of governments and states competing against each other on an international stage, they will use any resources they can think of. And if they think a cultural foundation is useful to advance their interest, they will try to instrumentalize it. They will try to capture it more. So I think it's, maybe Australia hasn't quite experienced that yet, but I think, that is a direction of travel in many other countries that we should be aware of, I think.
Perverse positivity really there, isn't it? That it's seen to be valuable and therefore will take it over.
I mean, the other question I wanted to ask was it relates to the role of First Nations and because if you ask people overseas, what's Australian culture? Now it's increasingly seen as, however superficial it is, whether it's, dot painters, but seen as some kind of Indigenous culture, First Nations and culture. And I actually saw, I don't know why I saw it, but anyway, an advert for Australian lamb. That just about 4 weeks ago. And in this advert for Australian lamb, it was some guy, and I think he was touring Egypt, and they were saying, "Oh, this pyramid's, 3,000, 4,000 years old," and he's going, "Well, in Australia we go back 60,000 years now," and he's like, classic. It seemed to me the crudest version of that, but I suppose it's about the disconnect between perhaps the actual closing the gap, the treatment within that, the fact that Australia leads on, as Tom said, it leads as a vassal state or a sub-imperial power for America, and yet wants to use Indigenous culture as a kind of benign, kind of a new identity to the world. I just wondered what you felt about that. How is that an abuse, or is it something that we can use? That should be done.
Yeah, it can be an abuse, but it can be a positive thing too. Obviously, it's just about how you do it. And there's all sorts of things you could unpack here. I work regularly with a variety of performing arts organisations. These days, every performing arts organisation will have KPIs, which include working with First Nations artists and doing projects around First Nations art. Sometimes those things are done really well, but I've also been involved in projects where you get to the end of the project and you can't help but feel, did the First Nations community who was involved in this get some long-lasting benefit from the community, or was it only the performing arts organisation that really benefited? So, there are some great examples of how that can be done really well, but I think, yeah, as a sector, we can still grow and invest more in that space. So I think we are learning relatively quickly how to do it in a culturally appropriate way and with the sort of long-term benefits for the Indigenous community in mind. But it's still a journey we're on.
I guess use my New Zealand privilege and reflect on how this looks in New Zealand, which is very different. And there it's to do with the Indigenous population, which I guess is much larger than the Maori population than it is in Australia. But also New Zealand is a much more Pacifica country than Australia certainly is. It's got the biggest Tongan population in the world, or biggest cities in the world, biggest Tongan city, biggest Samoan city, and so on. And I guess the people that you see on TV, the people that you see in Parliament, the people that you see reading the news look different to Australia. That was one of the things that struck me when I moved here, admittedly 20 years ago. Things have changed a bit in Australia since then. So I think that story is more easily told for New Zealand, especially when speaking to the Pacific, because New Zealand can make quite a plausible claim that it is a Pacifica power, that it is a Pacifica nation, because the foreign minister is Pacifica, because Maori, we have Maori play a dominant role in all political parties and in all walks of life. So I think the difficulty for Australia is that they've got a lot of catching up to do. A long history of marginalizing Indigenous voices, and then suddenly we have discovered this. Oh, we have a culture going back 65,000 years. What a great selling point, for the pyramids in Egypt. But you can't just start that from nowhere and pretend that the whole history hasn't happened. And I think it's a longer process of integrating Indigenous voices, Indigenous culture into mainstream Australian culture, if we want to call it in those terms. And mainstream voices on TV, on the radio, and other cultural spaces and so on. So I think plausibility, is a problem in Australia, because we can say that because it sounds good, and it sounds like we are finally acknowledging it, but actually there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, I feel the same. I think it's appalling, really. I think it's embarrassing for us to be able to sell a product internationally whilst we're doing what David's talked about earlier tonight. We've got a lot of healing, a lot of understanding. We're an all-white panel. We don't have First Nations voice. I feel uncomfortable talking to that, other than saying that we can only lean in personally and do what we can do. I acknowledge the Adelaide City Council, the City of Adelaide, who've just are putting up seven First Nations women, artists, sculptures of women in the city. First of all, that right's wrong from a gender perspective, but also, there are going to be long-term acknowledgement of amazing people, recent First Nations women in Adelaide, and that's cool. That'll help tell our story and let us and everybody learn. But we are not there. I also acknowledge some of the the artwork that's happening, that has to happen, is about telling uncomfortable truths, and we have this huge body of truth-telling to do. And that's what the role of Australian culture is to ourselves and to Australians in the first instance, before we start selling lamb, for sure.
Well, in that we've got a few minutes left for 7:30, I thought we could open it up to some questions from the floor. We've got somebody with a microphone. Did the person there at the front?
Just check it works.
Thank you very much. And it's great hearing all your respective perspective and experiences. I think Christy touched on a really good point that art and culture can inherently be dangerous. And I think one thing that I'd like to put, I guess it's two parts. First of all, we are also in a state where culture is a battleground in of itself. We have seen, one of the biggest national forms of soft power with the Venice Biennale and the pulling of Khaled Sabsabi and his project due to government influences or, arm's length board. So there was that as an issue. We've even seen it at a local level with Premier's intervention, let's just say, to Writers' Week. And the reflections were about, well, why don't we export more? And I guess some of it's actually rationalising Australia's own cultural identity, both the good and bad. We're seeing, presence in Greater Western Sydney of, growing Middle Eastern, Muslim communities and those kind of cohesions as well. We're also seeing Sydney Biennial and Sydney Festival, where there are actually efforts of cultural diplomacy or soft power. For example, Sydney Festival, there was I think an Israeli dance company and the funding and the distancing from certain bodies as well around some of that too. So I just wondered for your reflections about, there's this idea of sanctified culture, but even within our own kind of grapples, things are being defunded. There is the appropriate, there is the inappropriate. Yeah, just reflections for everyone.
Yeah, well, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
And that's its beauty. We know that. We know that the arts and artists are at the forefront of everything. I think they are. It's to put something to paper, to make something real, to have an idea come to life from, from wherever it comes from, means that it's uncontrollable. It's a field of work that gives us a sense of nourishment and understanding of who we are and what's going on in the world that is not controllable. We know when something hits the sweet spot and talks to us and makes sense and is funny or important and vibrates with us all. And that's the sort of stuff you just can't control. And I think I would like to think that we have learned our lessons in Australia. That's done at a federal level and a state level. Surely there can't be any more misunderstanding of the importance of surely letting artists speak their truth and do what they need to do. I know of more projects that are going to come up that will challenge this, and I trust that we're ready as a society, certainly in Adelaide and South Australia now, to hear them and see them and be led by them. I believe that. I'm an optimist. You know that. I'm sure that we've learnt those lessons. But that's not to say that there won't be interference. Not from government, but I think from louder voices, from the Pauline Hanson sort of vibe of the world at the moment. We'll complicate things and make it more difficult. But we stand firm and we let artists talk.
And good art can and should be challenging. And art is about ideas. And yeah, it's interesting to see this conversation about censorship, if you like, in Australia. I've, through my university role, I've had the opportunity to travel a lot in China the last couple of years, and getting to know that country has been really interesting. And I have a lot of friends in the arts there, but also in Hong Kong, and to see the difference between the two is quite fascinating, actually. It'd be interesting, maybe there's not time, but to get your perspective, Justin, on China. But it seems to me in China, this conversation between the party and artists has been going on for a long time, and it kind of ebbs and flows a bit in terms of what's allowed and what's not. But there is some kind of understanding of what will be allowed at different points in time. Whereas in Hong Kong right now, because there's uncertainty about what the party will do. There's a lot of self-censorship, which is perhaps sometimes even more dangerous than, the direct influence of the Communist Party. I've got friends who work in the visual arts there and run art galleries, and to put on an exhibition, you need to get a license, which is issued on the day of the opening of the exhibition, if you can imagine that. And the police come around and have a look and see what's there. So as a result of that, they have to do a lot of self-censorship before, and that creates all sorts of interesting questions. So, yeah.
Culture and art is always political, right? I mean, it's goes to the very foundations of who we are, what we want to do, how we relate with others, and so on. And often, a good way to hide a political argument is to frame it in cultural terms. So I think we can't get away from that. The reality that, the reason these things get shut down or pressured on is because they are political. It's not just a dance company. It is expressing something that is a political view that a different political actor doesn't like. And that's only going to get more difficult, I think, to resist those pressures because all these things are being politicized. Everything is politicized in our current moment.
So I just had a quick question for you, Tom. It actually goes back to a comment you made earlier about complacency. I mean, obviously, as a middling power as Australia is, we would probably be on par with, say, someone like South Korea, for instance, kind of. But South Korea, let's say 20 years ago, absolutely invested in culture and as an economic driver. That absolutely said through all that money at K-pop came out of that, their game development industry, their esports, and now that's a massive, massive international capitalist wonder child as a result. We're the same, roughly, same middling power. What's stopping us?
How long have you got? How long have you got to talk about developmentalist states? I think that's quite an interesting comparison, actually, because Australia has never really had a state-led economic development model. We were part of the empire. We just shipped all our sheep and everything to the UK. Once that ended, we just shipped it to other markets, including China. And we've basically been a country that relies on primary resources for our economic relations with the rest of the world. Whereas a country like South Korea, because it was born out of war, because it was at the very forefront of the Cold War, the state was much more involved in building up the economy, which is how they got their conglomerates that we're familiar with, car companies, tech companies, and so on. And I think they were much more conscious of that in the 1990s, that the next wave of industries is going to be the creative industries, is going to be e-commerce, like games and all that sort of stuff. And they put a lot of resources into it because that was the mindset of the bureaucrats, that was the mindset of the policymakers, and they had receptive interlocutors in the economy side and the business side who were like, yes, the state directs us, gives us subsidies, gives us encouragement, and promotes us as exports to the rest of the world. Very conveniently, that was actually also great culture and cultural diplomacy. Whereas Australia doesn't have that mindset. It's in terms of power, it's a rough equivalent of Korea. But it sort of seems to rely.
Yeah. But in the 90s, we were talking about creative industries. We were saying we're going to be a house of creative industries from 1990 onwards.
Yeah.
So Korea's saying it at the same time, we're saying it at the same time.
They invested in it.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Yeah. I mean, I went to Seoul to speak to the agency there. What's it called? Culture. And, it's a big, I don't know, 7 or 8 story building in the middle of Seoul, full of bright young things burrowing away, doing, I don't know, market analysis and you come to Australia and it's like creative industries, the future, millions, billions, and it's 2.5 people in a finance cabinet in a back room, So, but the myth was that it's all about small businesses, bottom up entrepreneurship. And in fact, the developmental state in South Korea and of course in China that showed otherwise.
Yeah.
With the trend with AI and everyone saying that jobs will be completely gone, other than, there's this ongoing trend to live performance. I think at the moment there is a kind of slight little bit of optimism in the creative sector. and that we may actually ride the bubble because of people wanting to connect with each other, and that experience will have so much more time because nobody will have a job. So live experiences and using your time to connect with humans is huge. And so if we ride that bubble, the arts have got a huge role to play.
You don't even need electricity to create art. So yeah.
All right. Well, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to close it now. And it was great to hear all you speaking on that. I mean, what comes across for me, I like what you said about that. It's the infrastructure of dialogue, however conceived that is. So the infrastructure of dialogue. But the other word I heard was trust. It's a big word in Europe as well, that you've got to trust the artist to do, or the cultural company to do that. And I think the third thing coming out of what Tom said is, Australia is in a great position to be able to intervene in this world and use culture to do that in some way. It's a no-brainer, I think, and to do that and to actually make a statement in that world, both among its near neighbours, but more broadly as some kind of defence of the rules-based international order, or a newer version of it, that it could do that, but for some reason it's just will not go there, and I think that's a real wasted opportunity. So on that positive note, I suppose, I'll close.
Thank you very much. That was a really thought-provoking and really meaty discussion. So yes, a big thanks to our panel and to Justin for their contributions. I thought it was fantastic. Our next discussion will be at the end of September, and it's part of a suite of events we're doing at the foundation, and other people are doing it in Adelaide too, to celebrate what would have been Don's centenary. He was born on 21st of September, 1926. And our next panel discussion is called "What Would Don Do?" Oh, well, we are, to a large degree, still living in an arts world that Don and his government created. And one little story, because there's always a story about Don. In 1957, as a young rising star of the party, he was selected to go to Cyprus as part of a fact-finding mission. Cyprus was in chaos, essentially decolonization and Greek, Turkish influence, etc. And he spent a couple of days meeting with people and accepting every cup of very strong coffee that was put his way. And he got back to his hotel after the second day and was very shaky and not feeling very well. And the concierge says, "We've got a special soup for you. You'll love it." And he drank the soup. He felt so much better, he asked for the recipe. And 20 years later, he put that recipe for the classic Greek soup, avokalimeno, in his cookbook that he published as premier. And, Don viewed culture as more than just the arts, but also food, but also what he loved was what surrounded the food. And he was much loved by the Greek community because he loved to dance and he loved to cook and eat Greek food. And it's interesting that I cannot imagine South Australia without Greek Australians and what they've contributed to us. Thank you. And we'll see you at What Would Don Do at the end of September.